My name is Dan Lair. I'm an assistant professor in human communication studies and the director of DU's debate team. And I just want to thank very briefly John for inviting me here to moderate the debate this evening. Very excited to have a chance to promote vigorous and fruitful debates here on campus. We're running sort of short in terms of time, so I'll keep things relatively short as an introduction. Tonight we have Professor Alan Gilbert of the Josef Korbel School of International Studies here at DU, and Colorado State Senator Shawn Mitchell, who represents District 23. What we'll do tonight in having a debate about whether or not Condoleezza Rice should stand trial, will be to start off with a 7-minute opening statement from each side. We'll follow that up with about an 8-minute period where both Professor Gilbert and Senator Mitchell can interact with each other, asking questions, then opening up the floor for audience questions and their responses, and then we'll conclude with a 2-minute summarizing closing statement from each side. So with that, then, let's begin with Professor Gilbert's opening statement.
So as Dan mentioned, after the first two sections of opening statements by our two debaters, and then by some kind of conversation between the two, we are going to be opening up to 3 audience questions. So at that point, just want to form a line if you have a question for the two debaters. So you'll ask the question, and then the debaters will each have 2 minutes to respond, and we'll be doing 3 questions for that. And one thing we would like to do also is to ask you to vote at this point right now, so our two debaters can see what they're up against on the question of should Condoleezza Rice stand trial for war crimes. So all of those who would vote in affirmation of that, please raise your hand. And all those opposed to should Condoleezza Rice stand trial for war crimes. Okay, so Senator Mitchell, you maybe have your work cut out for you. All right, so with that, I'd like to open the floor to Professor Alan Gilbert. Thank you.
The story of Condi Rice is a tragedy, at least for me. She's somebody I knew. She took 8 courses with me. She was a serious, thoughtful person. She was a quasi-radical. The depiction of Korbel in the film is a little off in the sense that he was a man who had lived in Eastern Europe when Hitler was rising. And the question of defeating fascism was for him the #1 question. And so the difference between the realism that he held here and a form of Marxism was slight. He fought fascism. The first thing that it would be good to think about is the importance of habeas corpus. Going back to the Magna Carta, what distinguishes a system of law from a tyranny is that every prisoner gets a day in court, that there is no indefinite detention, and the tyrannical authorities cannot torture you to get you to say whatever they want, which is all torture accomplishes. This is so basic to the system of justice and has been so remarkably violated in the last 8 years that conservatives, in particular, have spoken out against torture like Andrew Sullivan and Scott Horton and many others. I would distinguish the authoritarianism of the Bush regime and its principles, the principal actors in it, from conservatism. I don't think that the people who've been running the United States and have created a quasi-police state in which the executive can lock up and torture Americans, like Jose Padilla, who was arrested for possessing a dirty bomb or planning to make one in Chicago. And he was tortured for several years in a brig in West Virginia, and his lawyer said, he's a plant, because the techniques of torture they have now, actually it's been worked out by the CIA for the last 50 years using the techniques of a couple of Canadian psychologists. sensory deprivation, and so on, reduce people in this way. Now, what are the laws against torture to which the United States of America is a party? By Article 6, Section 2 of the Constitution, the Supremacy Clause, it's in the handout, I handed out before. Treaties signed by the United States are the highest law of the land. The United States signed the Convention Against Torture in 1988 and the Geneva Conventions in 1949. They bar the crime of torture. One of the articles of the Convention Against Torture, Article 3, says, even in war or in threat of war, you may not torture. That means that the current argument of the Democratic Party, which is, I think, in many ways a decent argument, we need bipartisanship and we need to work on the great problems of depression and two wars. And there are many other problems that the United States suffers because of the last administration and 30 years of rule of people who have let the rich run around like bandits. That's a good argument. It would be nice just to look to the future. But the fact is that the law is the law, and torture is a crime. Susan J. Crawford was a Cheney ally. She was appointed to be the head of the commissions at Guantanamo because David Addington, Cheney's assistant, liked her, wanted her. Susan Crawford said of what had happened to Mohammed al-Qahtani a month ago, or actually a little longer. She said, the combination of techniques used on al-Qahtani is torture, and therefore she forbade the prosecutors at Guantanamo from charging him. This changes the debate in the United States because this is a high-up person in the Bush administration who referred to the crime of torture. If you read the report by Carl Levin's committee, he's a Democrat, that John McCain participated in, it speaks of abuse. That's a word of art. This is torture. What is the torture in this case? What are we talking about? An Englishman who was born in Ethiopia named Binyam Mohammed was picked up in Pakistan. In 2002, he was rendered to several secret bases by the United States or foreign prisons. One of them was in Morocco. He was then sent to Guantanamo and charged with capital crimes by the Bush administration. His lawyers appealed in the English court because he's an Englishman, saying that the English government had evidence of the fact that he was tortured. The torture including cutting all over his body, including his penis, and putting acid in the cuts, threatening him with death, and, according to him, many other things. The British High Court ruled that he had been tortured and that there is an absolute ban on torture and that torture is a criminal activity and that no case against him could proceed. They were, however, told by the Bush administration and by the British government, David Miliband, the Foreign Secretary, that they could not say how he had been tortured. So I'm repeating his story here. I take it to be the truth. I take it to be the reason why they can't allow it to be torture. The British High Court said, we cannot imagine a reason in a democracy why evidence about the crime of torture should not be released. Could not imagine. But because first the Bush administration and then the Obama administration threatened them, they redacted the paragraph. Condoleezza Rice chaired the principals meetings at the White House which discussed what techniques of torture would be used on particular al-Qaeda prisoners, 4 of them. These included waterboarding, which is torture, drowning people, threatening to drown people. 100 prisoners have died in American custody. Prisoners have died in American custody.